background is the Bunker Hill Monument, and today I have a history teacher, so that gives me an opportunity to speak in a bit more depth than frequently I would be doing at Bunker Hill. First thing I would like to point out here is the map of Boston from 1775 in the background. It shows back here in Charlestown what we call Bunker Hill, where the monument is. The old town of Charlestown existed down here to our right hand side from where we're looking. Across the water is Boston, where Paul Revere would have been rowed across in his rowboat 2 months prior to that to raise the alarm before the battles of Lexington and Concord. Here we have the Old North Church from where the two lanterns were hung to give a visual warning back to the people of Charleston that the Redcoats were leaving Boston and going out into the countryside. But today we want to speak about the events of June the 17th, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place on this hill to our rear here, which is more accurately known as Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill is a hill 300 yards to the rear of here. The reason for the confusion is the English officer who was writing home a report of the battle got the two hills confused and called Bunker Hill Breed's Hill and Breed's Hill Bunker Hill. So today we know it as the Battle of Bunker Hill, but in actual fact it was the Battle of Breed's Hill. Now, 2 months before the battle, we had the outbreak of hostilities in Lexington and Concord. The English Redcoats were more or less chased into town by the militias. They were numbering about 12 to 13,000. They had the Redcoats surrounded in Boston and also out on Fort William and Mary, otherwise today known as Castle Island. This situation, of course, of having His Majesty's troops bottled up by a crowd of farmers was totally intolerable. 3 English generals were sent out to advise and assist Thomas Gage into what he should do to rectify this situation. In the back of those people's minds would be the obvious conclusion that one of those 3 generals would be soon to replace Thomas Gage because confidence in Thomas Gage had been lost in England. So, it was one of those guys would be going to succeed him. When those 3 generals came out here, General Howe, H-O-W-E, General Burgoyne, and General Clinton, they had a quick look at the situation, and it was fairly obvious to any military mind what had to be done. What had to be done was the Americans had to be attacked from the north in Cambridge, and in that way they would be caught between the English army and the river. They'd have no escape. They wouldn't be able to run into the countryside like what had happened out at Lexington and Concord to live to fight another day. Now, to engage in this battle, it would be a good idea to control the high points overlooking the future potential battlefield. That's basic military procedure right there. That entailed grabbing control and positioning some Redcoats on Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, and the hill that we were earlier, Dorchester Heights. That is overlooking any potential battlefield. This simple plan was formulated on June the 12th. It called for the Redcoats to come up here and take possession of the hill on June the 18th. On June the 13th, the American side got wind of the plan. They decided to preempt the English Redcoats. They ordered that the man in the statue up above yonder here, his name is Colonel William Prescott, they ordered him to come out here to take possession on Bunker Hill, 300 yards to the rear, with about 1,100 troops on the night of June the 16th. He was to stop at Bunker Hill because on Bunker Hill already at that time there was rudimentary fortifications that had been erected by the Redcoats prior to this. However, when Colonel Prescott got to Bunker Hill, for reasons known only to himself perhaps, he decided that instead of stopping at Bunker Hill, he would instead go forward 300 yards more and take possession of Breeds Hill, which is 300 yards closer to the English ships out on the water and 300 yards closer to town. However, there's no fortifications on Breeds Hill, so he's got to start from scratch to build fortifications up on Breeds Hill. Also, the fact that he's 300 yards closer to the English, it means they cannot ignore this guy. He's now within range. They've got to get him off the hill. Had he stayed on Bunker Hill, like he was ordered to do, the English may well have said, he's not a danger to us, we can just ignore him. That is very important to the rest of the story. At 4 a.m., the English ships down in the harbour seize activity up on the hill. They fire some cannonballs up here to let them know that they're onto them. One of those cannonballs takes the head of a man from Tewkesbury. When the American forces saw this incident, most of them were not able to take what had happened whatsoever, because they had never seen such a thing happen before. Many of those Americans began to desert from the companies of Colonel Prescott. Now, the English decided that they would muster 2,200 redcoats down here. They landed them on a place called Knowlton's Hill, down at the side here. They presumed that once their 2,200 redcoats were landed down there, that the Americans would fire perhaps, but then quickly run away. They would not engage and go toe-to-toe with the best army in the world. They were full of hubris of confidence. They also decided that they would wait till 3 p.m. before they would start the attack. That was allowed the tide to be at its height, so if they needed reinforcements, they would have ideal conditions to bring the reinforcements over. Now, that delay allowed the American forces to be reinforced in dribs and drabs. They're militias, they're not a unified army. That was another great disadvantage the Americans had. One company would not accept orders from a different company, even if the officer was higher in rank, because they would only accept their command from their local officer, which they knew. Over in the background here, we had on what we call the American right flank, we had men from Connecticut. They had higher officers than Colonel Prescott, but the de facto commander on the day was not the generals, it was rather the Colonel William Prescott. The most significant reinforcements that the Americans were lucky enough to get was Colonel John Stark from New Hampshire. He came across Bunker Hill to Breeds Hill with 450 men. This man, Colonel Stark, was a veteran of the French and Indian War. He was an experienced man. He immediately saw that the American left flank was totally undefended down here to the sea. He positioned his 450 men behind low stone walls on the left flank. Not only that, but he extended those fortifications down to the ocean, not to allow the English just to easily encircle them, which they had intended to do. Now, also the Americans were very low in ammunition. It is estimated that they only had approximately 8 balls of musket each in which to fire back at the redcoats. Some people have pointed out that prior to this, the month before, the Americans had decided to send a party up to Fort Ticonderoga. And with that party, they sent 200 pounds of black powder. And had that black powder been available to the American forces here on the hill, it would have been the difference between victory and defeat. But unfortunately, they did not have that powder. Now, from the English point of view, the operation should have been very simple. All they had to do was to cut off the reinforcements coming in to reinforce the men on the hill back to our rear at the Charlestown Neck. And in that way, it's the middle of June, when water supplies are not allowed to come up to the forces here, the Americans would have no option but to surrender. However, General Howe with the thought of perhaps being commander-in-chief in the back of his mind, decided he'd be more aggressive than that, and he was going to launch an attack. At 3 p.m., he launched his attack in two forms. The main attack was to be against the American left flank over here on this side. The other attack was a feint, or a disguise attack, a decoy attack by General Pickett up to the front. But the main attack was to the left flank. The Americans, of course, are dealing with a lack of powder. Their musket is what's known as a Brown Bess musket. It has only an accurate range of about 60 yards, so you've got to be real close for each ball to count. So Prescott would have given the famous command, do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Because every shot had to count. Now John Stark actually was more specific. He actually counted out 40 paces and put a stick in the ground and told his men, don't fire till they get to see that stick. Some other people said the instruction was, do not fire till you see the tops of their stockings in the grass. Believe whatever you will. The English advanced. Some Americans were firing against them, disobeying orders. However, when that happened, the English would stop and return fire, which of course was complete waste of time, energy and ammunition, because in those days, using a Brown Bess musket, you have to aim high because the musket ball drops. So those people are aiming high. Even if they weren't aiming high, all the Americans had to do was duck down behind the stone walls, and it's going to go clear out over their heads. None of the Americans sustained any injuries whatsoever in that return fire. However, the tree branches up over head level was cut to ribbons. So that was very inaccurate shooting. When the order was finally given to return fire, the Americans popped up. They unleashed a blistering volley of fire into the compacted English redcoats with devastating effect. Cut them down. All the officers in the front row, except General Howe himself, was cut down in actual fact in that barrage. The English were thrown back in total disarray. The decision then is, what are we going to do? General Howe decided he would repeat the first action again, hopefully having better luck the second time. The second action had the same result as the first action. Now we're at the crucial point of the battle. What is going to happen? Are the English going to try to have a third attempt, or are they going to accept defeat? At this point, the other general, General Fenton, he's over in Boston. He's watching the proceedings through eyeglasses. He's very unhappy with what he's seeing, of course. He gets into a rowboat. He's rowed across with 900 fresh Marines as reinforcements. He addresses the men that are already here, and he points out the obvious fact to them that the boats that took them over from Boston are over in Boston. There is no means of escape. The instructions he gives those men is conquer or die. Those are the two options, and that is the battle cry then for the English from that point on. He also approaches General Howe and has a couple of words in his ear, and General Howe then addresses his men and instructs them to take off their backpacks, get rid of their water supply, their canteen, their foodstuffs, everything except their musket and their bayonet. They won't need it. In 10 minutes they're going to be victorious or they're going to be dead. He also instructs them that instead of a flanking movement, the attack now is going to be very simple. In 3 columns, they're going to go straight up the center. They're going to march up. They're going to accept the incoming fire no matter what the devastation is going to cause. Because once they get to the top of the redoubt, they will just march in over the top. Once they get in over the top, it is over, because the Americans have no bayonets. The English, of course, are very proficient with the use of the bayonet. It'll be a rout. That is exactly what they did. By this time, the Americans are out of ammunition. They're reduced to actually using their Brown Bess muskets as rude clubs. They're reduced to picking up stones from the ground, throwing the stones back at them. Once the Americans are faced with these people coming over the top, it is time then to retreat. Now I want to talk a bit about a very significant man that we haven't talked much about before this. His name is Dr. Joseph Warden. Dr. Joseph Warden is the American Patriot leader, in a sense, before the revolution here in Boston. He is an intellect on the same level, in many people's opinion, as Thomas Jefferson. They say that because once the Intolerable Acts were introduced, the Americans were saying, well, what are we going to do to answer these acts? Dr. Joseph Warden put pen to paper and he wrote what's known as the Suffolk Resolves, in whereby they were resolving to answer these Intolerable Acts. They're written out in the county of Suffolk, hence the name, the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves are very, very important because Paul Revere, the messenger, brings it down, delivers the Suffolk Resolves to the Continental Congress that's meeting in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress looks, reads, likes what they read, and adopts the Suffolk Resolves as the foundation of what they are going to do to answer the English laws. Now, he's also a very proficient man from the military side of things. He decides he wishes to be a military man. So in every skirmish before this and in every engagement, Lexington, Concord, other engagements, Dr. Joseph Warden, even though he's a civilian, gets into the thick of things, fights like a regular man. He's a militiaman like everybody else, but not an officer. He is granted from the provisional Congress out in Concord, he is granted a commission to serve as a general. On the day of the Battle of Bunker Hill, he is ill in Cambridge. Somebody tells him that there's going to be action up on Breed's Hill. He gets out of bed, he makes his way over here to Charlestown. He comes on to Bunker Hill, where there's about 1,000 of Americans who should be up on Breed's Hill. Instead of that, they're dallying around Bunker Hill. He asks General Putnam, he says, General, where is the action going to be the hottest today? And he's told the action is going to be the hottest up in the redoubt on Breed's Hill with Colonel Prescott. That is where Dr. Joseph Warden decides he's going to go. Now, while this is going on, we've got to bear in mind that there's 1,000 men back at Bunker Hill, and Putnam is trying to get these people to come up and to reinforce them. They're all finding an excuse not to come up. There's no reinforcements coming. Added to that, there's a colossal amount of desertions from the American sides up here on Breed's Hill. They're fleeing back to the safety of Bunker Hill. And it is at that time when the besieged men up on top of the hill here, they look to the rear, and instead of seeing a lot of people coming to help them, they see one man walking towards them. And of course, they don't know who this man is, but as he gets closer, they realize he's dressed in the clothes of a gentleman. So it's obviously somebody of importance. And when he gets close enough to realize who it is, they're absolutely dumbfounded to realize it is the political leader, Dr. Joseph Warden. It would have come to them as a massive boost in their morale when they really needed it, to see one very brave man obviously putting his life at great risk, where there's 1,000 men not doing what they should be doing that day. So he joined them in the redoubt. When the English went up over the berm into the redoubt, Colonel Prescott then has to order a retreat to get back to Bunker Hill. Normally, when they're retreating in a rout, the Redcoats would advance against them and cut them all down. They did not do that for two reasons. One, because in the first two advances they had become so exhausted that they didn't have the energy to continue on another yard, not being able to pursue them. And number two, when Colonel John Stark, down here on the left flank, when he saw that if what had to happen did happen, that they were going to be overrun, instead of acting suicidally and joining the redoubt or going back to Bunker Hill, he positioned himself to be in a position to offer covering fire to the retreating Americans going back to Bunker Hill. That is why the Americans were able to successfully get back to Bunker Hill without losing a great number of people. However, the one man that was killed up in the redoubt was Dr. Joseph Warden. He got shot in the face and he ran through 3 or 4 times with a bayonet killed. Now, the loss of Dr. Joseph Warden is irreplaceable, and I have seen historians claim that had Dr. Joseph Warden lived, that George Washington would only be a footnote in American history, because the leader of the American forces in quick time would have been Dr. Joseph Warden. The result of the battle is a Pyrrhic victory for the English. An American general was heard to remark, "If we can sell a few more hills at this price, we will surely win the war." Their casualties that day from about 35 combatants were 218 killed and 800 plus wounded, for a casualty rate of approximately 1,100 out of 3,500, which was horrendous casualty rates. Now, 9 months later, when the potential battle of Dodge's Heights was about to take place, that would be in the back of the English minds, that they were facing a horrendous battle, and no doubt that added to their decision to evacuate when the ice came to Iraq. That was the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Americans would have won that day had they had more ammunition, had everybody followed orders, and had there been an army, not 3 groups of differing militias. And that is Bunker Hill in a nutshell.